Hello everyone, and welcome to my piece of the Humanly 2020 capstone. Before we get into it, just one short disclaimer. The information in my presentation is based off of research and my own experiences from working in fashion, so by no means do I speak on behalf of any clothing retailer. Alright, so I'm Giselle, and for the last 3.5 years I've been working towards my degree in information design. I've had the pleasure of surrounding myself with incredible thinkers and change makers, so I'm excited to share with you my research and findings on my topic of choice. Before I started my journey at Mount Royal, I had been working for 11 years, mostly in clothing retail. As you can see by my smiling face each year, I've truly appreciated the opportunities I've been given to explore the world of information design. So let's get started. So when I decided on my topic, I felt that my research fell under Goal 13, Climate Action. The United Nations website states, "Climate change is affecting every country on every continent. It is disrupting national economies and affecting lives. Weather patterns are changing, sea levels are rising, and weather events are becoming more extreme." Although greenhouse gas emissions are projected to drop about 6% in 2020 due to travel bans and economic slowdowns resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, this improvement is only temporary. Climate change is not on pause. Once the global economy begins to recover from the pandemic, emissions are expected to return to higher levels. So when deciding on my topic for this year's Humanly project, I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to research, yet I didn't grasp how connected it was to climate change. Through my own personal experience over the last year, I realized that while my purchasing of clothing may have completely ceased, stories of boredom shopping and retail therapy kept occurring. I wanted to better understand these connections and the current state of where the textile and fashion industry are in their efforts to be more sustainable and eco-friendly, and what these words actually meant to those larger corporations. For this project, the question I asked is, how might we reduce the systemic problems of fabric and textile waste? This question naturally occurred to me through my experiences and attitudes towards clothing over the last decade. Originally indifferent to clothing and fashion in general, I found myself working in the retail industry of selling clothes. Yes, that's me in the center 8 years ago, processing the thousands of pieces of apparel that came daily, unknowingly being a part of a huge systemic loop. The question of waste had never occurred to me, as I'm sure many others can relate. Clothing can be seen as just a necessity, or it can be seen as an extension of oneself. We either appreciate it or treasure its lifespan. But once it leaves our closets, it's out of sight, out of mind. I had never stopped to think that there's a good possibility that the jacket I donated or the shoes I trashed are somewhere out in this world, either with a second chance at life or sitting in a landfill 20 years later. My question sparked the journey of understanding what happens to our clothes, but it guided me to look further past our landfills and why this is happening and what else it's causing. There's a loop that exists, and while many people I'm sure know of its existence, it's hard to fully understand just how complex it can get. I'm hoping that with what I've found, I can bring into perspective this system and perhaps encourage some responsible consumer behaviors when it comes to clothes. It can be hard to approach the topic of fabric waste as it's something we've all contributed to, whether we realize it or not. While fast fashion has been a topic of discussion due to the overloaded landfills and overwhelmed recycling centers, it's hard to convey just how large the issues behind the textile industry truly are. We are well aware of the consumer's point of view behind the life cycle of clothing. However, the conversation usually changes when it comes to various topics such as the following: where these clothes came from, the processes of how these clothes are made, or even the raw materials themselves and how they came to be. There are so many connections of systemic issues that have not been a major part of the conversation, and while they've been acknowledged, it's still not taken seriously by the vast majority of consumers. To acknowledge what has been done and to look forward to what you can do is all that it takes to make a shift. When I began the research into my topic, I knew what many people have come to know. There are huge piles of clothes in our landfills. Workers who make these clothes are poorly treated and underpaid, and these factories pump toxins into the rivers and worse. However, steps were being made by large fashion companies to right these wrongs, and many stores have come out with sustainable lines or recycled material lines, so consumers just had to make a choice, right? They've placed the onus on us, the consumers. And yes, while there are many incredible movements to protect the people and the environment, these things keep happening. So, like all who are curious, I wanted to find the source of this information. Where is it coming from? Who started it? Why is it still happening, even though we've heard of the factory collapses, the overloaded recycling centers, or these online clothing giants that are so incredibly popular right now, shipping us masses of cheaply made clothes from overseas? I started writing down things that stood out to me as negative. While there are absolutely many positive things happening, like alternatives such as slow fashion and ethically sourced fashion, the intent of my research was to focus and find the error of our ways and find solutions that are mindful and low to no cost to be respectful of all situations, and thus the loop started to show itself. I ultimately selected 34 issues that stood out to me while reading through the articles, journals, websites, academic papers, and documentaries sourced in my bibliography. I found these to repeat throughout the research in some way or another, and while many stood out as obvious, some were actually new to me. I'd like to select a few for you today to break down just a bit further. Let's start with a very obvious one. Cheap clothing can mean different things to different people. Cheap as in affordable, cheap as in cheaply or poorly made, or both. While I know I was always ready for a good deal on clothing, these campaigns are designed to sell you more clothes than what you could ever need, to make you spend your money so that the store you shopped at could make their goals set by corporate based on the prior year's sales. That in itself is a loop. So let's look at some of the materials that are used to make these clothes cheap. I'm also curious to know if your eyes were drawn to the red sale signs like mine are trained to do. Synthetic materials such as nylon, polyester, acrylic, and acetate are incredibly popular in workout wear and all those soft, stretchy, plush-like clothes we've come to love. These clothes have a high synthetic fiber content and have been known to cause skin irritations, rashes, or even allergic reactions. What's worse is that these materials could take anywhere from 20 to 200 years to break down, while shedding microfibers and microplastics into 83% of the world's drinking water. A lot of our washing machines are not equipped with the technology to catch these microplastics, so every time your laundry is washed, a tiny amount is lost in the water. Yes, there are companies that have developed products to help catch these fibers, but it can be pricey for the average customer. So to try and put it into perspective, the cute dress I bought 12 years ago still exists out there somewhere in the world. My winter jacket from elementary school back in the 90s might just be starting to break down. The jeans I wore in that previous picture of me 8 years ago might have been in good condition, but instead ended up in the garbage during the sorting at the donation center. A lot of our clothes don't last past a few washes and are not quality material to donate. While those deals may have sounded great at the time, cheaply made clothes don't last long and ultimately do more harm than good. So I'd like to now touch on the topic of environmental laws. This was the point that I didn't understand the full extent of. You may have noticed the images hiding behind those shiny red sale signs. While I'm sure we've seen the pictures of the pipes pouring discolored water into rivers or the scum and garbage floating on the surface of lakes, we tend not to ask questions past that point. It's just assumed that someone is breaking the law or disrespecting local communities. And while by no means is there perfection when it comes to land preservation and protection here, we do take for granted that we have clean drinking water and access to fresh fruits and vegetables. The reality is that our clothes are very often and most likely sourced to be made in small countries without strict environmental laws. This means that there are no repercussions when facilities turn off their mechanical systems that purify water after dye and chemical treatments. The water then pours into the lakes and rivers, where many locals fish and much of the wildlife source their drinking water. This leads to contamination of water and food sources, which then leads to illnesses, deformities, and more within the people who have no choice and cannot relocate away from these factories. Another example is the excessive use of pesticides that's required for crops of raw materials, such as cotton. Farmers in India typically apply the pesticides for their crops manually using a container carried on their back. While there are no regulations on how much is used, over time they have to increase the potency in order to protect the crops from failing. This increase in pesticides has led to extreme deformities, cancers, and even deaths among those who live in the surrounding villages, and of course the farmers themselves. The farmers may already be in debt from the purchases of the seeds, to the purchases of the pesticides, and if they don't use more, their crops could fail. Even the deterioration of the land can lead to crop failure. And the loop continues until the farmer can no longer pay back the corporations who wait on these crops of raw materials, and he or she may pass from cancers or ultimately take their own life. In the past 16 years, over 250,000 farmers have committed suicide from situations such as these. And while I'd love to talk forever, as I have 32 other points to go into, those are just two examples of the issues that form their own loops, and of course are part of a much larger loop. It can be incredibly overwhelming to wrap your mind around how twisted together many of these issues are, and there's no easy solve for most of them. How our modern society operates makes it quite difficult to just shut the whole thing down. And while there are absolutely sustainable and local options, these tend to be priced incredibly high and aren't realistic for a vast majority of the population. So I'd like to show you some of the process of how I came to build my systems map. I wanted to build something that wasn't too complex, but still showed that the system itself is far from simple. I started with sourcing different types of materials as mentioned earlier, articles, academic reviews, documentaries, etc., and started writing down things that repeated and stood out to me. After compiling a large list, I had a lot more points than originally expected and wanted to see how these were connected. I ended up drawing out a mind map to find the connections, and through this was able to categorize them the best I could into 4 categories: environmental, ecological, economic, and social. From here, I realized my desk was not big enough, so with a massive piece of craft paper, I ended up creating a connection circle on my living room floor. I was able to arrange the points in such a way that would make more sense to the observer versus keeping it in the mind map format. I then took a photo and using Photoshop connected the points to show what affects what and ultimately visually showing where the loop started to form. So here is my finished systems map. I understand that this may be hard to decipher, so I pulled out the different sections so that you can see on your right that you may find it easier to see the connections. My map is also located on my page on the website, so please, if you have time, take a closer look. So while it's clear that there are a lot more connections, for the sake of time, I highlighted just one of the loops within this large system as an example. Starting with big business interest, I refer to the companies and corporations behind the fashion and textile industry as big business, but essentially it's your traditional fast fashion retailer giants looking to make a buck. Consumerism, of course, we've been trained to want more and buy more through marketing, social media, social pressures, etc., which then ultimately just leads to cheap clothing. Touched on this earlier, but the clothes have an extremely limited lifespan and won't be in your closets for long, ultimately ending up in the landfills. Almost 12 million tons of clothing waste in North America happens every year, and it was reported just this past October that China has roughly 26 million tons of clothing in their landfills. The low environmental laws, there are no restrictions on how we discard of our used clothing. There is nothing in place saying that we have to recycle these materials. If you don't want them, you could bring them into a center, but it doesn't guarantee that they're fit to be resold or donated. Out of sight, out of mind. This leads to crop adaptations. Because of these lower environmental laws, it allows for the lands to be dumped on and overused with chemicals, leading to crop failures. The plants change, requiring more pesticides due to weather and climate change fail altogether. And then those big business threats come in. The companies who invest in these farmers want their products. This ultimately loops back into big business interest. This was just one example. The system is much more complex than I could ever show you in one illustration, but I hope my examples were able to relay the message that this is a very real issue. I understand what I was able to present to you really only scratched the surface of the systemic issues behind fabric and textile waste. The purpose was to show that the system is much more complex than I ever thought it was, and it was so much more harder than I realized to find the answers to my previous who, what, and why. The answers to these, I believe, are quite hidden. There are many companies that use the words sustainable and eco-friendly, but I encourage you to do a little digging before making a purchase. Additionally, during my research, I was very eager to help support a lot of incredible brands that are available on their own journeys to help shift the mindsets of consumers and have a healthier impact on society. However, I found myself in the position where there was no need for me to buy anything. If you do not need, do not buy, even if it means waiting to support an ethical brand. The clothes you have right now have your attention. There is nothing wrong with them, and if there is, could you mend it yourself? Would it be worth having it fixed or altered to give it a new life? Many of us discard our clothes when we see the smallest flaw. One small choice I've made this year is to mend what I can. If you find yourself in the position of needing something, could you thrift it? Could you rent it? These can be inexpensive alternatives to buying a new piece outright. Doing one less load of laundry a week could make a significant difference if you're able to do so. There are even calculators online that can help you gauge just how sustainable your closet and behaviors actually are. However, by no means am I looking to guilt or shame if you want to buy something brand new. Remember, my job was to convince you for almost a decade that you had to buy more than what you needed. I am not innocent here, but I've started a new journey for myself. The hardest thing for us to do is to break the habit that consumer culture has developed. The simplest, most inexpensive way for someone to make a change and help break the system is to simply choose not to buy it if you don't need it. There's nothing I can do now about my old winter jacket or my once cute dress from 12 years ago, but going forward, I'll ensure that I will do what I can to reduce my fabric and textile footprint. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who took a moment of their day to learn a little bit about fabric and textile waste. It's a topic that seems to drop in and out of conversation over the last few years, yet it's always there and steadily increasing. I've learned a lot over the last few months researching this topic and over the last few years as an information designer. I hope I was able to reach you and encourage a change in perspectives if this was a topic that you've never considered. It's certainly been a challenging year, but it's allowed me to see what's most important: the health and happiness of loved ones and a healthy and happy planet for all. Thank you.